everybody to the Law Day celebrations here at Fort McNair in the Military District of Washington, the Joint Force Headquarters, National Capital Region. I'm Colonel Corey Bradley. I'm the SJ for MDW, and it's really a pleasure to have everyone here today. It's a gorgeous day outside, and so and hopefully we have a terrific presentation today for you. It's really my honor to host this event, and as you know, today is a law day, and we're celebrating the national heritage we have of the rule of law and how we honor that and how it facilitates justice and freedom and equality for our country and really acts as an inspiration for the entire world. Let me welcome our distinguished guests. General Chipman, thank you, sir, for being here, the TJAG of the United States Army. Our other distinguished guests, I see many colonels and friends, JAG Corps and others in the command, my MDW staff, the Center for Military History is here on Fort McNair. Welcome to those individuals, and really thanks for joining us on our Law Day celebration. Law Day, of course, as I say, is an opportunity to reflect a little bit on where we've been and the importance of rule of law in our nation. And as we did that this year in particular, it's important. The focus is we're focusing on the equality of justice, and in doing that, it's a perfect time. This is the 50th anniversary, as many of you know, of the Martin Luther King Jr. I Have a Dream speech. It's the 150th anniversary for Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. And so, as we were planning the Law Day events this year, several months ago, we thought it would be appropriate to tie Lincoln to our Law Day presentation because Lincoln has so much tie to Fort McNair. And I will tell you, as we're planning that, we're thinking what we're going to do, and to my great surprise, one day in comes to my inbox the Army History magazine. And I should step back one more step. If you've ever been to the office of the Judge Advocate, the Staff Judge Advocate here at Fort McNair, I have a Lincoln room, and so the money guys don't worry that I have too much space. It's also my copy room. It's also my witness holding area. So, but on the walls are portraits of Lincoln. A Stivers print of Lincoln when he came to now Fort McNair. We have the pictures of the execution of the Lincoln conspirators of his assassination. And I can tell you, I've often looked at those, and there's a picture of some other guy, Holt, and I as a judge advocate, I am familiar with him, but I wasn't always sure how that all tied together. And you look at these photos, and I've looked at them long and hard and known that there's a real story behind them. I was familiar that it occurred here, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But I didn't know the true story. And so then I get this magazine as we're planning this, and on the cover there are those same photos. And so I was very excited that the history was there. And then the article was about the trials that occurred here at Fort McNair. And then I recognized the author. And that I knew would be the perfect Law Day event, someone who can bring history alive. A longtime friend and a true scholar. If you read his bio, he's a bachelor's in history, JD, an LLM from the University of Brussels, another LLM from the Judge Advocate General School, master's degree in strategic studies from the Naval War College, #1 in his class, by the way. Master's degree in history, 20th century history from the University of Virginia. So a true scholar, but also a man who has walked the ground of the judge advocate and the trials and have familiarity with how that would go, and could bring that judge advocate, the trial, alive. And if you've ever read his work or heard him speak, you know he can tell a story, and he can make that history of the judge advocate really come to life. And so I was really excited to invite Colonel retired Fred Bork here and to present to us the trials of the Lincoln conspirators. And so with that, if you could give me a great welcome for Mr. Fred Bork. Fred.
Well, good morning, one and all. I'm a little bit nervous after that introduction because he's promised a lot, and I'll see what I can do here As Colonel Bradley said, I've been around the JAG Corps a number of years, and so I actually do know something about military legal history. What I want to do is, in about 45 minutes, talk to you about what happened right here at Fort McNair, or the Washington Arsenal as it was then known, in May, June, July 1865. In fact, May the 1st, 1865, was the very date that then President Johnson, who had succeeded Lincoln after the president was assassinated, ordered the trial by military commission of the conspirators to take place. So, again, I'd like to go through this, I think about 45 minutes, but I certainly welcome your questions at any time. If you want to interrupt me, that's fine. If you want to wait till the end, that's fine as well. This, of course, is what it is all about, considered by both the American people and professional historians to be our greatest president. Washington, as the father of our country, always is a very close on the votes, but the American people and professional historians consistently see Lincoln as the greatest president. But Lincoln is also unusual in that he's frozen in time. Because he was shot and killed on April 14th and died on April the 15th, he goes out, shall we say, on a high note. He wins the war. He doesn't have to deal with Reconstruction. So it's a very open question as what it would have been like had Lincoln survived. But having said that, because he wins the war, because he preserves our Union, he is seen as such a great president. And his Emancipation Proclamation, his transformation of a war from a struggle over Union to a struggle for freedom, begins, of course, the path that culminates in racial justice for black people in this country in the last part of the 20th century, a struggle that continues. So this is what I want to talk about today, a little bit of background, some context, nature of the conspiracy, and then why a trial by military commission, aftermath, and conclusions. So let me give you a little context here. It's 150 years ago, but it's a very different country. How many Americans do we have today? How many people are living in the country today? Who can tell me, more or less? Yes, sir.
305 million.
That's right. About 305. I think we're going to probably show anywhere between 3.5 and 3.10, but that's exactly right. The census of 1860, 31 million Americans. That's it. So 10 times more today. 31 million Americans. 21 million live in the north, 9 million live in the south. But what's the big difference? The big difference is 4 million of the 31 are enslaved. There are 4 million enslaved African Americans in 1860. So it's a very different country. And the war, although at the beginning about Union, ultimately becomes a struggle over the future of what Thomas Jefferson called that peculiar institution. And let me give you a couple of other pointers here to give you a context. The median age of Americans today is about 37 or 38 years old, which means that I'm definitely on the downside. But the median age in 1860 was 19. So think about it. Half the country are teenagers. It's a scary thought. Would you want that today? I think not. In fact, most demographers think that in the time of the Revolution, remember the Revolution is only a couple of generations away, we think that the median age of those living in America was about 15 or 16. Median age is 19. By the way, life expectancy in 1860 in Lincoln's period is your late 40s. Not unusual to find somebody in their 50s, but life expectancy is late 40s. So as an aside, for those of you who know the Constitution, If you figured that the median age during the Revolution is 15 or maybe 16, think of what it meant in those days to say, to be elected to the House of Representatives, you must be 25. And how old do you have to be president? 35, right? 35. So if I tell you that the median age, even in the Civil War period, is 19, to require 25 for a member of Congress or 35 for president is really a significant requirement. Today we tend to say, oh, well, so big deal, people live to be 70, 80. Now we don't think you're really old until you get to be your 90s. But this is the context. So what the Founding Fathers couldn't solve in the Revolution was the question of slavery. And so they kicked the can down the road. And it finally comes to a head for a variety of reasons with the election of Abraham Lincoln, who, although he says, I'm prepared to keep slavery if that's what it takes to preserve the Union, no one in the South believes that. And the Southern states secede in 1861 on the issue of slavery. It's not about states' rights. They say at the time, we're seceding because we're worried about slavery. And so the Union then is what the war is all about. And let me also remind you, if I can, that if you're Abraham Lincoln and you're born in 1809, the United States is only 20 years old when you're born. And when you're growing up, the Republic and this idea of a union of states is a great experiment. Everywhere you look around as an American, countries are run by kings. In the Civil War, there's an emperor, a puppet emperor named Maximilian in Mexico. So whereas today we think, well, union, of course we want to have a union, this was not at all a sure thing. And Lincoln and men and women of his generation believed that allowing the South to secede would destroy the Republic, would destroy the United States. And that's why soldiers were prepared, because they believed in this great experiment, the United States of America, that's why they were prepared to go to war and to fight so hard. So the Union goals are pretty easy. We're going to preserve the Union. And the Confederate goals, let us go. Let us go. Let us have our own separate states, and we'll call it the Confederate States of America, and we can therefore have slavery. That is then what it's all about, at least at the beginning. Everyone thought the war was going to be short. It's not going to last that long. A couple of months. But by 1864, it's dragged on for more than 3 years, and Lincoln is up for re-election in November, and he's pretty convinced he's going to lose. There are a lot of people in the North who are saying, why are we fighting this war? Why is it worth spending all this money? Why is it worth shedding blood of our sons? Why are we trying to hang on to these states? If they really want to go, just let them go. But Lincoln says, no, we're not going to. We're going to pursue it to the end. We're going to preserve the Union. But he thinks he's probably going to lose. And who's running against Abe Lincoln in 1864? The Democrat, General George McClellan, who had earlier been the commander-in-chief of the Army. So you can see here, we're not talking about a Republican ticket, but we're talking about the Union nomination in 1864. Abe Lincoln and his Vice President Andrew Johnson from Tennessee, not an accident you'd pick somebody from a border state like Tennessee, because Lincoln quite correctly understands that the key to victory is holding on to border states like Maryland, Kentucky, Tennessee. And so Andrew Johnson is his vice president. And who will win, we don't know. But the big thing that turns the tide is Lieutenant General Ulysses Grant takes charge of the entire army in March of 1864, begins his famous overland campaign, begins to roll up victories, And when Sherman marches into Georgia and Atlanta falls in September 1864, the American voter likes a winner. And so Lincoln is reelected. He's reelected in November of 1864 for another term. He takes his oath of office for his second inauguration in March. In those days, folks, we didn't have the president take the oath of office in January, but it was in March. And so we're in March of 1865. Richmond falls early in April. And who surrenders at Appomattox April 9th, 1865? Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. Now, the war is not over, but most people think if Lee is surrendered, that's probably the end of the war. That's April 9th. Lincoln is shot on April 14th. Just 5 days later, he dies the next morning. In this day and age where we're maybe not cynical, but at least not surprised by these things, it's a little bit different. But ladies and gentlemen, I can tell you that when the president was shot, the newspapers called it as nothing different than the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. It was a seminal event. Just as in my generation, I remember exactly where I was when I heard that John F. Kennedy had been assassinated. And the most recent generation knows where they heard 9/11, the attack on the World Trade Towers and the Pentagon. Challenger disaster might be another one of these. This was one of those events. Oh, my parents' generation, Pearl Harbor. This is one of those events that people were absolutely shocked about. First president ever to be shot and killed. But it didn't start out as an assassination. In fact, originally it was a conspiracy to kidnap. John Wilkes Booth and the other conspirators had the, you might think harebrained, but maybe not so harebrained, idea to kidnap the president and spirit him away to Richmond, where the Confederacy, which then had its headquarters in Richmond, might use Lincoln as a bargaining chip to get a negotiated peace. But folks, this is in the days before there's any security really for the president. If you went to the White House in April of 1865 and you walked up to the door, which you could, and you knocked on the door, it was very likely that the president himself would answer the door. If you were a citizen and you simply wanted to meet with the president, you could do that. Now, there was, of course, a sergeant or two around to provide some security or act as an aide de camp, but as a general rule, there's hardly any security. And Lincoln was in the habit of riding alone in the District of Columbia as he went about his business, maybe to go to the War Department to see about sending a telegram, or in this particular case, he regularly went out to a military hospital to visit the wounded. And so the conspirators had planned on March 17, 1865, to kidnap the president as he rode on horseback to the hospital. The only reason that the kidnapping plot failed was because Lincoln changed plans that day and didn't visit the hospital. Would the kidnapping have succeeded? Well, there's no way to know. Would Lincoln have resisted the kidnappers, have been harmed, or perhaps been killed in the kidnapping attempt? There's no way to know, but it started out as a conspiracy to kidnap. What changes everything is a speech that Lincoln gave at the White House on April 11th. But who said this? This country was formed for the white, not the black man. John Wilkes Booth. The actual assassin, the leader, the kingpin of the conspiracy. And it's John Wilkes Booth who is responsible for the metamorphosis, the transformation of the conspiracy to kidnap into a conspiracy to murder. And it's all because of what Booth believed about the role of black people, African Americans, in this country. Now, who was John Wilkes Booth? Well, we'll get to that in just a second, but the real question is, why the change? Lincoln gave a speech on the White House lawn, April 11th. He says, look, the war is over. Lee has surrendered. Sure, there's still some Confederate troops in the field, but I have every reason to believe that victory is here. And he begins to muse about the role of African Americans in the United States in the future. And Lincoln, who had originally been prepared to keep slavery, but then had transformed the war into a struggle for freedom, now says, if we do the right thing, knowing that 100,000 African American men have served in the Union Army and a decisive contribution, maybe it's time to give the vote to some black men. Well, for Booth, this was anathema. Not only had Lincoln destroyed the country by freeing the slaves, but now what's worse, we're talking about giving political power to African Americans. And Booth said, by God, that's the last speech he'll ever make. I will run him through. And all historians now think that this is the metamorphosis that causes the kidnapping to turn into assassination. It's bad enough that Lincoln has freed the slaves, now he wants to give them the right to vote. But I think, and I think this is borne out by the record, that Lincoln understood that freeing black people from slavery was not enough. If African Americans were going to have any meaningful future in the country, they had to have some political power. Now, at this time, the only voters who can vote are white males. So when Lincoln says, I'm going to give the franchise to some black males, probably African Americans who'd served in the Union Army and could pass some sort of literacy test, this is a radical idea. But Lincoln is one of those amazing men whose transformation in office is such that he really sees that the future has to be some sort of political power for African Americans in the country, or else freedom is not going to mean anything. But for Booth, it means I'm going to kill him. And so here are the conspirators: John Wilkes Booth, David Harold, Atzerodt, Lewis Powell, Samuel Mudd. I'll talk about them briefly. Here's the rest. I put Jefferson Davis in parentheses because the government really believed at the time that the leaders of the Confederacy were behind the assassination. Then they really believed that Jeff Davis knew about the plot to kill Lincoln and may have actually organized it. So, John Wilkes Booth, he's a very, very famous actor. I would say maybe in my generation or my parents' generation, he's the, who would this be? Robert Redford, an older Robert Redford. But probably today, if we were talking about John Wilkes Booth, he has the star power of Lenny DiCaprio. Notice I'm not picking Brad Pitt. I'm picking Lenny. I think that's probably true. He's not... Maybe he could be a Ryan Gosling, if you've seen Ryan lately. But Ryan has more tats, I think, than John Wilkes Booth ever had. But in any case, he's very famous. He's from a famous acting family. And one of the reasons that it's so easy for him to get into Ford's Theater is because he performs there all the time. So when he comes in, it's, good evening, Mr. Booth. Nice to see you, Mr. Booth. And when he walks up to the president's box and puts a bullet in the back of the president's head, he's able to do that because he's in a place where everyone expects him to be. David E. Harold, we don't have a lot of time to talk about Harold, but he's the one who's with Booth when Booth is shot and killed in the fiery barn as he's surrounded by federal troops. But he's referred to by the media as Booth's dog-like follower. Only 22 years old. And these are young people. Young people. George Atzerodt, he's an immigrant from Prussia. He's one of the conspirators. His mission was to kill Vice President Johnson. And we'll talk a little bit about the goals of the conspiracy in a minute. He was supposed to kill Vice President Johnson, but he lost his nerve and instead got drunk and wandered around all day. So the lesson there would be careful who you assign the mission. Lewis Powell, this guy's the muscle. He's the muscle of the conspiracy. He's probably almost as large as General Chipman, and certainly just as powerful. He's a big guy. And if you figure in this period, the average man is about 5'8", weighs 145 pounds. I mean, it's not a coincidence that when you walk into a military museum, you see how small the uniforms are for these Union and Confederate troops, because people were smaller. But this guy's big. 6 feet, 6'2", over 180, maybe 200 pounds. He's the muscle. He'd served with Mosby's Rangers, so he's seen some combat. And his mission is to kill the Secretary of State. He goes in with the idea of shooting the Secretary of State, but his weapon misfires or he has some problems getting the round off. And so he stabs Seward in his bed and nearly kills him. He believes, in fact, that he has killed him, but Seward survived. Samuel Mudd, the doctor, the jury, the panel was very confused by Mudd because he doesn't fit in with the other conspirators. First of all, he's a medical doctor. He's a little bit older. He's in his 30s. And this is a day when we tend to believe that doctors and lawyers are a better class of people than the average person. But Mudd had, of course, he set Booth's leg. It's not an accident that John Wilkes Booth seeks out Samuel Mudd to get his leg set. He seeks out Mudd because they've met previously, and there's every reason to believe that Mudd knew about the conspiracy to kidnap. Perhaps did not know about the conspiracy to murder. And Mudd, of course, like all criminals, does himself in because he's not entirely honest with the authorities, and so they tend to believe, well, if you lied about this, Dr. Mudd, why should we believe you when you say you knew nothing? Samuel Arnold, another one of the conspirators, he's one of Booth's friends. He definitely was involved in the conspiracy to kidnap, but did he know about the conspiracy to murder? Michael O'Loughlin, was he tasked with killing General Grant? At the time, Judge Advocate General Holt and others thought that O'Loughlin might have had the mission to kill Grant. And that was because General Grant and Julia, his wife, were supposed to be in Ford's Theater that night watching Our American Cousin with the Lincolns. But at the last minute, the Grants didn't go. So there is an open question, or there was at the time, as to maybe O'Loughlin was supposed to kill Grant. So you kill the Vice President, you kill the Secretary of State, you kill the President, and you kill General Grant. That's the conspiracy. And Ned Spangler, he's the poor dope outside Ford's Theater who is holding Booth's horse. As he runs out after shooting the president, jumps on his horse and rides away. Now, no one thinks today that Ned Spangler knew what was going on. He thinks he just held Booth's horse, or we think he just held Booth's horse because he's a nice guy. But you can see the guy who's holding the keys for the getaway car in the bank robbery. Does anyone really believe you didn't know they were going to rob the bank? Same thing with the horse. And then finally, the only woman in the conspiracy, Mary Surratt. She runs the boarding house that still exists in Washington, D.C. It's on H Street, I think. And at the time, people said, well, she had the nest that hatched the rotten egg. The rotten egg being the conspiracy. And everyone believes, well, you certainly had to know about the conspiracy to kidnap, and because the plotters are meeting at your home at the boarding house, you must be in on the conspiracy to murder the president. And by the way, isn't your son, John Surratt, the best friend, the bosom pal of Booth? And the answer is yes. And at the time, although I think we might not agree today, at the time everyone said, every mother knows what her son is up to. Right? Some question as to whether or not, if John Surratt had come forward, if he turned himself in. By the way, he's escaped by now. He's in Canada. If he had turned himself in, maybe the government would have let his mother go. It's an unanswered question, but it's certainly a possibility. She made 3 decisions in her life that was to cost her dearly at trial. The first one was that she had married an alcoholic at a young age, and they were quite wealthy in southern Maryland, but in the end, his alcoholism caused the fortune to be dissipated, and that's why she has to move to Washington, D.C. to run a boarding house, which is still respectable, but not as respectable as being a landowner in southern Maryland. So her first mistake is she's in Washington, D.C. running a boarding house because of this bad marriage. The second mistake that Mary made was she converted to Catholicism. At this time in Protestant America, Catholics are considered to be subversive, anti-republican, and not to be trusted. And for those of you who are old enough to remember, in the election of John F. Kennedy in 1960s, there were a number of people who said, we cannot vote for a Catholic because of his allegiance to the Pope. In fact, there was a book published in the 50s called American Freedom and Catholic Power, which argued that Catholics were a danger to American freedom. Well, this feeling is even stronger in the Civil War period, and the fact that Mary has converted to Catholicism is definitely a prejudice held against her by the court members. And her last decision is hanging around Booth. She's absolutely infatuated with him. He's a movie star, a snappy dresser, good looks, polished, has money. There's no evidence that there's a romantic relationship, but everyone says she is infatuated with him. And consequently, the government believes any moth that's flying that close to the flame must know exactly what the plotters are up to. The New York Times described her, as again only the Times can, as fair, fat, and 40. Well, but she was known as a belle in her youth. Very beautiful. And that's actually true. They did describe her that way. So when Bob Redford made the movie The Conspiracy, I'm happy to say this is who he cast as Mary Surratt. And this, they didn't actually pose this way. This is a Photoshop picture of the conspiracy. Obviously, Booth is gone because he's been shot and killed in the burning barn. So, the one who got away, John Surratt, he was a Confederate spy. It was quite typical for, in this period, you simply crossed the river, you crossed the Potomac from Maryland to Virginia, taking supplies, you were a courier. He flees to Canada before the assassination, and then he's actually apprehended in Alexandria, Egypt. Not so sure that this was an extradition treaty with the Egyptians in this period, but he comes back and he stands trial in D.C. in 1867 for the murder of the president. And then finally, the last conspiracy, Jefferson Davis. So we talked a little bit about this, the victims, and then this really comes to the crux of the conspiracy from the government's view. Seward, Johnson, Grant, and our president. What actually happened? Booth comes into the presidential box. He has a small Derringer, a small gun, and he shoots the president in the back of the head in the middle of this play, Our American Cousin. At Seward's home, Powell comes in, stabs Seward, nearly kills him. Seward's protected, or actually lives, because he'd had a bad carriage accident and he had a neck brace on that was made out of steel and metal, and as Powell was stabbing him, he was unable to stab through this neck brace and kill Seward. So although Seward lost a lot of blood, he did survive. Vice President Johnson, he escapes because Atzerodt gets drunk. And U.S. Grant, we really don't know. There's the chair in which Lincoln was sitting when he was shot. This, by the way, is up in Detroit at the Henry Ford Museum. Not sure how it got up there, but... And this is the shooting. Again, a still from the movie. Booth jumps down onto the stage at Ford's Theater. If you haven't been to Ford's Theater in the district, you should definitely go and see where it all happened. It's been restored. And he raises this and says, "Thus also do tyrants," right? In Latin, of course. And then almost immediately, the Army says $100,000 reward for the murderer. $100,000 is a lot of money in this period. This is a multi-million-dollar bounty. The prosecutors, Joe Holt, the Judge Advocate General of the Army, a native of Kentucky, Henry Burnett, a shooting officer who had tried the famous Copperhead case of Vallandigham, been successful. And then John Bingham is a member of Congress, and he's appointed as the assistant prosecutor. Bingham does most of the work in the trial that takes place over here in Grant Hall. Originally appointed by Lincoln, he'd been the Secretary of War, Secretary of the Army, under the Buchanan administration, but he's a loyal Unionist, and he's from a border state, Kentucky, and so Lincoln appoints him as a colonel and the Judge Advocate General at the beginning of his administration. Shortly thereafter, when the Army is reorganized, he's promoted to Brigadier General. One of the reasons that Joe Holt never appears in a military uniform is because he was directly commissioned in the Army as the Judge Advocate General. He could have worn a uniform as a Brigadier General, but he chooses always to wear a suit. So, Stanton and Holt, Stanton's the Secretary of the War, they see this as nothing more than a plot by the Confederacy to accomplish off the field of battle what they've been unable to do in 4 years of fighting. Lee is lost. The rest of the Army is gone. But if we decapitate the Union leadership, if we kill Lincoln, if we kill Grant, if we kill Seward, and if we kill Johnson, we'll decapitate the Union leadership, Washington will be thrown into chaos, and we, the Confederates, can win. This is what Stanton and Holt believe has really happened. And certainly at the time, there's every reason to believe that it's very possible. And consequently, Stanton and Holt say this is a war crime. Lincoln is the commander-in-chief. An attempt by these enemy belligerents, the Attorney General of the United States says that the assassins are enemy belligerents. Sound like a familiar term? Unlawful combatants, enemy belligerents. They've committed a war crime, killing of the commander-in-chief. Military operations are still ongoing. But more importantly, what they are doing is intended to disrupt and thwart Union military operations. And that's why Speed, who's the Attorney General of the United States, writes in an opinion, not only is it a war crime, and not only could they be tried at a military commission, they must be tried at a military commission, and not in a civilian court. So that's why the Army then takes charge of the prosecution of the Lincoln conspirators at a military commission that is held right here at Fort McNair in May, June, and July of 1865. Decapitation. That's what they believe at the time, and that's why Jeff Davis is an unindicted co-conspirator. Here's one of the prosecutors, Henry Burnett. John Bingham is quite known to us as lawyers because he's the author of the 14th Amendment, considered by most attorneys today to be one of the most important amendments and used by the Supreme Court to apply most of the Bill of Rights to state practice. And here they are sitting together with Joe Holt in the middle, Secretary of War Stanton. So the President orders the trial on May the 1st. President Johnson, now the President of the United States, convenes the Military Commission, orders it to be held, and you can see the timeline. Trial begins 9 May. If only we had a process like that today. Only a hypothetical. I couldn't help it, General Chipman. I couldn't help it. Trial begins. Trial begins right over here in Grant Hall, and I hope if you have time, we'll walk over here afterwards and take a look at it. The Military Commission. The military commissioners are all Union officers. Now, this is the sort of jury you like. Who signs all those commissions for Union officers in this period? The President, personally, is signing these commissions. So all these court members owe their allegiance to the President. And as Union officers, it stands to reason that they would not look kindly on secession Confederates, right? They're all shooting officers, and importantly, not a single one of these panel members is a lawyer. So they will simply vote their conscience and be unfettered by legal niceties. This is the President. One of the most famous members of the court is Lew Wallace, who is familiar to some of you as the author of Ben-Hur. Remember the movie Ben-Hur with Charlton Heston? Yes. Lew Wallace is the author of that book. And you can see Joe Holt sitting on the far right as the Judge Advocate General. This is a beautiful system, ladies and gentlemen. In this period, the Judge Advocate goes back with the panel on its deliberations to help them. He does not get to vote, but he does help them if they have any questions. It's all a matter of doing the right thing. Here's the actual courtroom, and if you go over to Grant Hall, you'll see it's pretty much reconstructed like this. You'll see the 3 columns there. People came in, visitors came in, could watch. It was open to the public. So, the commission itself. There are no presumptions. Most importantly, there's no presumption of innocence. In fact, all professional historians believe that the court members came in believing that the conspirators were guilty. Rules of evidence. Any evidence the commission wants to hear may be heard. Anything that's probative to a reasonable person. Anything that's relevant, you can listen to. And voting on guilt and sentence, a little bit different from today. Majority vote for guilty, 2/3 vote for the death sentence. You know, today at courts martial, it's quite different. But in this particular time, military commissions and courts martial, majority vote for guilty, and then 2/3 for the death sentence. About 366 witnesses appeared in the trial that started. The first day of testimony is May the 12th. Trial runs through June. The jury goes into deliberations, panel goes into deliberations on June 29th, 1865. And the evidence, again, is whatever the panel wanted to hear. A lot of the evidence that came in initially was of other Confederate atrocities. For example, the death of countless Union prisoners at the hellhole called Andersonville. That was seen to be part of the larger conspiracy to harm the Union effort. The government tried to show that Jeff Davis was involved, but really couldn't. And I think all historians agree today, with rare exception, that Davis really did not know that Booth and his followers were planning to kill the president. But at the time, the government thought otherwise. So these are the results of the trial. The results come out on the 5th of July, 1865. Sentenced to hang, sentenced to imprisonment. You can see the sentences here. The record goes over for affirmation by the President, for him to take action on findings and sentence, and then on the 7th of July, 1865. Right out here, like on the tennis courts, the gallows are set up, and the four hang, including Mary Surratt, who's the first woman ordered to be hanged by the federal government. Here she is, a still from the movie as she's being led to the gallows. And there's actually an official photographer taking pictures here. And you can see these are the gallows, and they're being led up there. And you see the umbrellas. Well, why are they having these umbrellas? Are they afraid of rain? No. It's about 100 degrees, 98. They're afraid if they don't have umbrellas, Mary Surratt or some of the other condemned might faint from the heat. And so we're having umbrellas to make sure that nobody faints and messes up the hanging. And they also, you can see here, maybe not on this, but you'll see it in the next picture, they've actually bound Mary Surratt's legs because they're certainly afraid as she drops through and is hanged, we wouldn't want her dress to fly up and someone might see her legs. So we're going to make sure that when she hangs, that it's all done. So they're hanged right here, and then they're put in some shallow graves. Later on, the families were allowed to come get them. Very, very unusual photos, and since this time, there's not ever been an official photographer at any military execution of Americans. We certainly took pictures of Germans who we executed by firing squad or hanging in Europe in World War II, and the Japanese as well, but none of Americans. So these photos are very unusual and very rare. So, in the aftermath of the trial, everyone thought, well, she's been condemned to death, but no one's going to hang Mary Surratt. I mean, after all, this is the Victorian era. We don't hang women, do we? And the jury actually votes for death, but then sends a petition for clemency to the Judge Advocate General for him to take to President Johnson, asking that Mary's life be spared. Johnson claims he never saw the petition, and he blames Judge Advocate General Holt for withholding it. It's nonsense. Johnson knew that the petition was out there, but it was politically expedient and easier to let her hang than to commute her to life. And so that's what happens, and then when the political pressure is on, Johnson says, well, it was my lawyer's fault. The aftermath, of course, 1866, the famous case, Ex parte Milligan, where you know the Supreme Court in a landmark case says, not so fast, no military commissions for American citizens if the civil courts, civilian courts, are opening and functioning. But ladies and gentlemen, that was 1866. This is 1865. A lot different milieu. And so that means, though, that John Surratt is prosecuted in U.S. District Court. He's very smart. He admits from the very beginning, I knew all about the plot to kidnap. I was in on that, but that never happened. And I knew nothing about the conspiracy to murder the president. And by the way, I was out of town. I'd already left when it happened. Well, not surprisingly, there's a mistrial. 8 not guilty, 4 guilty. The government decides we're not going to continue this prosecution. John Surratt goes free, and he dies in 1916, age 72. But for the rest of his life, a lot of people behind his back said, well, you saved your life, but you could have saved your mother's life if you'd come back. And you didn't. So no one really looks good. Jeff Davis, there's talking about putting Jeff on trial for treason. It never happens. He goes back to Mississippi and dies in 1889. So that's it. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Right here. I tell you, just as I expected, a tremendous presentation, and as I say, now I can look at those photos and know the characters, and I knew you would bring them to life, and as you did, and a perfect Law Day presentation, and I really think it's germane to what we're seeing today. It ties the history of Fort McNair and Lincoln. And Fred, thank you so much for being here. On behalf of the Guardians of our nation's capital, the Military District of Washington, Joint Force Headquarters, thank you today for presenting.